Scruffy-looking nerf herders need not apply, as Atari Archive looks at The Empire Strikes Back. In May 1977, filmmaker George Lucas's movie Star Wars made its debut and rapidly went on to become an unexpected, massive success. With a long theatrical run and a vast sea of merchandising, Lucas's mashup take on World War II and the sci-fi serials and samurai movies of his youth informed what audiences expected out of science fiction and helped further cement the concept of a blockbuster movie. In 1980, Star Wars saw a direct sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. Such sequels were something of a rarity at the time and typically weren't the draw that their predecessors were, but in the case of Empire, it went on to make nearly as much as Star Wars did. And Empire certainly did not slow the merchandising machine that the first Star Wars movie created, leading to the first in a very long line of video games to be based on the series. Star Wars' influence on pop culture, and in particular video games, cannot be overstated. You can find its DNA in games as far-ranging as the XD coin-op Starfire or Midway's Space Encounters, or console titles such as RCA's Star Wars, Mattel's Star Strike, and computer games such as Star Raiders for the Atari 8-bit line, or even Ultima on the Apple II. But only here, in 1982, did the actual license find its way to a game, rather than just serving as visual or thematic inspiration. And it comes to us from a new video game publisher as well, Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers was founded in the 1880s by George Parker, who later recruited his brothers to help run the business. Primarily, Parker Brothers sold board and card games, and is perhaps best remembered for selling stalwart titles such as Monopoly, Clue, and Risk. Run by the Parker family until its sale to General Mills in 1968, whereupon its leadership remained in the Parker family line but now had higher-ups to answer to. Parker Brothers as a company saw incredible growth in the 1970s, becoming a player in the electronic game market as it emerged that decade. 1978's Merlin game, which became the industry's #1 selling toy the following year, proved to the company that electronics were worth pursuing, though the electronic game industry's shakeout in 1980 also showed that nothing was guaranteed to last forever. A lesson Parker Brothers itself understood well due to the cyclical nature of the toy industry, but one unfamiliar to its corporate overlords at General Mills. The collapse of the electronic game market led to the company's first real rough period under the General Mills management era, and inadvertently led to it entering video games. Parker Brothers would end up becoming one of the most prolific third parties of its day, with releases showing up on the VCS, the Mattel Intellivision, the European and Brazilian Odyssey 2 markets, the ColecoVision, the 5200, and a slew of computer platforms. Executive-level politicking led to incredible losses as the video game market softened despite the warnings from Parker's staff, and the company largely left the video game space in 1985. But here, in 1982, it was in on the ground floor of a blossoming console market. Fortunately for us, there has been a great deal of scholarship about how and why Parker Brothers entered the video game market, including interviews with former staff and executives, graciously shared by historians Alex Smith and Ethan Johnson, and 2 published books. Former Parker Brothers executive Philip Orbanes' 2004 title The Game Makers, detailing the history of the company into the 1990s, and 1988's Playing by Different Rules by Ellen Wojahn, which specifically looked at its era of ownership by General Mills. Through these sources, the picture of Parker Brothers' entry becomes clearer, and hinged initially on Rich Stearns, who oversaw marketing of Merlin and sought to refocus his team as the electronic game market collapsed around 1981. Stearns was a video game aficionado, and after recruiting another Parker Brothers marketing manager, Bill Bracey, the two brainstormed the best approach to entering the home video game arena. Serendipitously, General Mills Toy Group Vice President Jim Fifield had heard that Lucasfilm was interested in licensing out Star Wars for video games. Kenner, another toy company owned by General Mills, had the license for Star Wars toys and had been made aware of Lucasfilm's interest in this new frontier of entertainment. Stearns and Bracey determined that it made no sense to design and sell a bespoke Parker Brothers game console when Atari and Mattel had largely sucked up the home game oxygen, not least of which, Stearns told Smith, because there was a finite number of game systems that could survive on the market at a given time. Therefore, they could be far more successful making games for other companies' platforms. Phil Orbanes, who had joined them as well, set engineer Mark Lesser to the task of reverse engineering the VCS to keep them legally clear from Atari. Stearns remembered another technical team member, Don Miffett, was also working on this project, while Rex Bradford, a programmer, told Johnson in an interview that his boss, Jim McGinnis, also was well-versed in software programming versus hardware and was involved as well. After a few months, they successfully had figured out how the VCS worked in a way that drew no challenges from Atari. When Stearns and Orbanes pitched Fifield in July 1981 on this approach, he noted that while they had ample designers to come up with original titles, they would likely see a great deal of success and speed by buying up existing licenses, as Atari had been doing. Heavy advertising from the start, Stearns pitched, according to Wojahn's book, would position Parker Brothers as a premier company to survive the inevitable industry shakeout. And so Parker Brothers announced its video game plans in the 1981 annual report, released weeks after that meeting. At the 1982 Toy Fair in February, Parker Brothers announced its first 2 VCS games to release in the summer, both of which were licensing coups, The Empire Strikes Back and the popular arcade game Frogger. According to Empire Strikes Back programmer Rex Bradford in a 2010 interview with GamesTM.co.uk, the Star Wars license was the result of Bracey negotiating for it directly, as he and Stearns worked on securing domestic licenses, while the head of Parker Brothers and grandson of George Parker, Ranny Barton, focused on Japanese licenses. Kenner already having the Star Wars license made this fairly straightforward, of course. Barton told Smith that part of General Mills' structure allowed some licenses to be shared among the conglomerate's parts. Bradford was a fairly new hire to the company, and was paired with the game's designer, Merlin inventor Sam Kelman, to make a game out of the then newest Star Wars movie. Lucas himself had very little input, Kelman said in a 1983 interview, with Lucasfilm's role largely consisting of just approving the game design and final product. The pair delved deeply into the game's development in a January 1983 feature in the pages of Electronic Fun with Computers and Games. The final game is focused entirely on the opening action sequence from Empire Strikes Back, where the heroic rebels try to defend their base on the ice planet Hoth against gigantic AT-AT walkers. A sequence that would be repurposed for video games many, many times over in the future. Players control a rebel snowspeeder in a horizontally scrolling play area with a series of AT-AT walkers marching from left to right, akin to arcade games like Defender and Super Cobra, though Bradford told Johnson that while they were aware of those titles, they weren't trying to copy them. If any of them reach the right edge of the map, as evidenced by a radar image in the bottom of the screen, they destroy the power generator, providing a shield to protect the rebel's base, ending the game. The walkers, being heavily armored, take 48 hits to destroy, and will change color and slow down as they take damage. Periodically, a blinking square will appear on a walker, indicating a bomb hatch. On some difficulty levels, the walker will then deploy a homing smart bomb. But this also opens up a vulnerability, as hitting the walker in one of these blinking squares automatically destroys it. The walkers will also fire regular shots in your general direction, though the speeder can take a couple hits itself before being destroyed. By landing on the ground, you can repair your speeder 2 times per life, and if you manage to survive on a single life for 2 minutes, the Star Wars fanfare begins playing, the speeder begins flashing, and you become invincible for 20 seconds as the Force is with you. Since the number of AT-AT walkers will never equal 0, you will inevitably lose the game, much as the Rebels failed in the movie. But in the meantime, Empire Strikes Back makes for a fairly intense experience. The Battle of Hoth is well thought out, but Kelman said that this was just one of many different ideas they had for the game. Others included weaving through the asteroid belt with the Millennium Falcon, but that was discarded for being too similar to Atari's own asteroids. Recreating the Death Star trench run from the first movie was a possibility, as was a lightsaber duel. Bradford remarked that at one point all of these scenes were considered for a single game, but they realized that was beyond what they had for memory on the VCS, as well as beyond their level of experience with the hardware. As Bradford put it, if they wanted to have multiple scenes, they would have had to sacrifice a lot of the speed and action of the final game to make it fit. With the premise finalized, Kelman designed the actual play loop and all the graphical elements, with Bradford implementing them into the program within the confines of the console. Bradford was also responsible for the very slight parallax scrolling effect, the idea for which he credited to McGinnis, and all of the sound cues. Bradford remarked that the game audio had to be carefully considered, given the VCS only has 2 sound channels and about 80 available noises to ensure a panoramic experience. Further, he noted that thanks to the Star Wars theme, this was the first time he was aware of that a VCS game featured more than just 3 or 4 tones put together for a tube. Aside from Apollo's Racquetball and Lost Luggage releases in June featuring little intro ditties, I'm pretty sure he was right, and honestly the Star Wars theme works really well here on the VCS hardware. Various ideas didn't make the cut due to the pair being limited to a 4KB cartridge and 128 bytes of memory. Kelman recalled wanting to include a way to trip up the walker's legs as protagonist Luke Skywalker does in the movie, while Bradford remembered a scrapped idea where you could enter tunnels at the foothills of your snowspeeder to pick up bombs that you could then drop directly on the walkers, sort of how Namco's Sky Kid worked a few years later. In the movie, the AT-ATs are gunning for the power generator energizing the Rebels' defensive shield, and this was also missing as a visible element from the VCS version. Bradford remarked that had they removed the smart bombs the walkers can launch after your speeder, they probably could have managed to make a visible generator, but told Johnson that the bomb, a fairly late addition to the game, was necessary to give enough variety to keep the game interesting. At one point, the pair had also considered having pieces of the walkers fall off as they take damage, but ultimately opted to have them change color instead. Parker Brothers debuted Empire Strikes Back and Frogger at a Minneapolis reception in June, according to Playing by Different Rules, which incredibly involved flying guests in first class, providing them with product presentations, a cocktail dinner, a laser show, and a performance by comedian Alan King. This apparently worked out well for them, as Parker Brothers reported receiving $60 million in orders almost immediately, $20 million of which was from Empire Strikes Back. Contemporary newspaper reporting suggests that Empire was expected to reach all stores by August, although there are some indications from newspaper ads and the video game update that some copies were available in July. Given that Parker Brothers already had existing distribution channels with many major retailers such as KB Toys, Toys R Us, and Kmart, they largely utilized these for their video games, Stearns told Smith, though they did develop a separate sales force from their usual toy and game salespeople to deal specifically with video games due to the unique language and knowledge required. Parker Brothers undertook an absolutely massive advertising campaign for both Empire and Frogger, released the following month in August. An article from the New York Times Newswire printed in January 1983 reports that the company spent $10 million to advertise those two games. For context, they report that the average movie's ad campaign was about $6 million. And Parker Brothers, with its reputation and splashy entrance, clearly had no problems convincing retailers to stock their product. Alongside Frogger, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back sold in excess of 3 million units, according to reporting in the Boston Globe, albeit with Frogger being the bigger seller of the pair. Coupled with the order information from Playing by Different Rules, it's likely Empire sold around 1 million copies by itself. Today it's not a particularly difficult game to find on the collector market, underlying just how many of these Parker Brothers churned out and sold. Nor is it a bad game. Parker Brothers didn't produce too many original game designs, so it's welcome to see that Empire was a solid first entry by the company. The walkers take a lot of hits, which is something the developers noted they saw some criticism about, but it also makes actually bringing one down feel special. The real tactics for success is to weaken the first and last walkers to slow down the entire march and delay new walkers from spawning, then cleaning up those in the middle and taking out new ones as they enter the field. This gets progressively more difficult over time as the walkers speed up and get more aggressive, but once you get a feel for the game, it's manageable, until you load up a more difficult game variation. The range of difficulty options really help this game shine. In addition to starting you at more advanced points in the game with more aggressive and accurate walkers, there are selections that allow the walkers to unleash those homing smart bombs, game variants that make the walkers solid and impossible to fly through without crashing, or both. Finally, the difficulty switches adjust how small the landing areas are to stop and repair your speeder. Though once you get the hang of moving it around, this isn't too big a hurdle. The base game mode is fairly straightforward, as the only way you can really die is to get shot enough times by the walkers, which in turn move fairly slowly. Adding in the options to make the walkers solid so that you can't fly through them adds a new layer of complexity, as you now have to be mindful of where you are on screen while zooming around. Solid walker games actually introduce a new layer of strategy. Crashing into a walker will do 25 points of damage, earn you some points, and set you back at the far right of the screen if you have another life in stock. So you can strategically do so if you need to take out a walker nearing your shield generator. It's the smart bombs that really make this game, however. The walkers don't launch one every time a hatch opens, but the way they zip around the screen makes them difficult to shoot down or avoid without just running for it and leaving the walkers to continue their march. The speeder also controls quite unlike most player vessels on the VCS. as it will slow down and speed up to a degree as you push left or right on the joystick, meaning there's a bit of momentum as you slow down before you can turn fully. The only real downside to the controls is, well, the VCS controller. Empire demands a fair amount of maneuvering around the playfield, which can get exhausting rather quickly with the stock VCS controller. You also will probably get pretty tired due to how rapidly you need to hit the button to get a good firing rate out. It's best if you just plop the Atari controller on a table to play this one, rather than try and brace it in your other hand, as otherwise you'll be hurting in no time. The 2-player mode is also a bit of a disappointment, as it will always reset your walker count to 5 on damaged units after a death so as to avoid having to retain the game state in the console's meager amount of memory. That said, saving on cart space and console RAM with this approach did allow for the game to come off as well as it does. It's not the most incredible shooter on the VCS, but it's fun, can be set up to be rather challenging, and has the novelty of really being the first non-arcade licensed property on the console since 1979's Superman. And it is the first one period to be based on something specific, like a singular movie. Empire Strikes Back saw a splashy debut and sold pretty well, and reviewed incredibly well too. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz showered it with praise in their September 1982 review in the pages of Video, where they commended it for having the kind of flashy graphics that had done well for Activision and Imagic, the parallax scrolling, visual language of the AT-ATs, changing color as they take damage, and the use of the Force as a gameplay mechanic. They concluded by noting that it would have been easy to churn out a mediocre piece of fluff and let the license carry the game, but that Parker Brothers had truly made something entertaining. An October column by Lou Hudson in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram said it was surprisingly good, with enough aspects of Defender to be interesting, but not enough to make it a simple copy. The Video Game Update highly recommended Empire, calling it great fun for Star Wars fans, while Ed Driscoll gave it a largely positive review in Space Gamer, dinging it only for the lack of visual indicator for the shield generator, and not featuring any of the other elements from the film's Battle of Hoth, such as other snow speeders, or being able to attack the walkers on foot or with a tow cable. Ironic, given the potential play elements that had to be dropped due to cartridge space. Videogaming Illustrated's own Game Awards gave Empire the top spot for games based on non-arcade properties, beating the likes of Atari's Superman. TV Gamer also remarked that Empire was a solid choice for fans of scrolling shooters a la Defender. On the flip side, Logical Gamer found it a good try, but a game that didn't quite hit the mark or maintain its challenge, while Joystick's How to Win at Video Games edition praised its graphics and said that it may be good for younger players, but that Activision's Chopper Command was a purer Defender-esque experience. And Video Games praised mechanics such as being able to repair your speeder and the walkers getting periodic weak points, but overall found it dull given how many shots were required to bring one down. Parker Brothers had a tendency to make their games available on a wide range of platforms, as the company was going to be platform agnostic, as Stearns and Orbanes had initially pitched to Fifield. But Empire Strikes Back only appeared in an official capacity on one other system, the Intellivision. Released in August 1983, there are some key differences between the two. While the VCS playfield is only 8 screens in length, the Intellivision's is 15. The walkers now only take 30 hits to destroy and only change color twice in the process. Your speeder, in turn, can't take quite as much damage as it could on the VCS. These changes help speed up the pace of the game slightly, and likely were also made to accommodate the Intellivision controller, which is very much not designed around fast action games. It still plays well, and having built-in rapid fire is incredibly welcome given the location of the fire button on the side of the controller. And unofficially, the game was cloned a few times, primarily for European computers. An unofficial Empire Strikes Back conversion appears to have been written for the Atari 800 in West Germany, while Jeff Minter's Attack of the Mutant Camels plays very closely, simply replacing the walkers with giant camels. Empire Strikes Back is a solid debut for both Star Wars and Parker Brothers to the VCS, and the company would publish several more games with the license, including a home port of Atari's own 1983 arcade Star Wars game, written by the folks at Imagic. Kelman appears to have ceased VCS work after Empire. As for Bradford, he'd work on another VCS Star Wars game for Parker Brothers before going to Activision, a story for another day. I'll delve into it a little more when we get to Frogger, which was a much bigger hit, but the success of those two games are really what caused Parker Brothers to go all in on the video game market. The company quickly found itself staffing up to an incredible degree, sidelining its traditional board game business, and investing in a wide variety of licenses and platforms. It did this despite the industry-wide red flags noticed by Barton, Stearns, and Bracey that were consequently and deliberately ignored by Fifield, who sought bigger numbers at the expense of Parker Brothers' long-term health. A frankly familiar story with the modern hellscape of video game and tech industry layoffs and vulture capitalism. But for now, we have Empire Strikes Back, solidifying Star Wars as fertile ground for video game experiences and serving as the first of two pillars that put Parker Brothers on the map as a force to be reckoned with in the video game market. Next time, we're all Diamond Dogs.